Do you know why they call me the Count? Because I love to recite the alphabet. Ha 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 ha.
For love, calling heaven above. Send me an angel.
We've seen a lot of games that have broken new ground and introduced never-before-experienced video game play concepts here on NES. We've also seen a lot of games that were just content to recycle other people's ideas. But as HAL demonstrates with Air Fortress, sometimes the tried and true isn't that bad. On paper, Air Fortress seems like the most derivative game we've seen since, I don't know, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, or The Adventures of Dino-Riki. In action, it certainly contains its fair share of "I understood that" reference, but the aggregate feels one of a kind. Certainly it has a unique look to it. With its chunky little protagonist and blocky graphics, Air Fortress's visuals don't really resemble anything previously seen on NES. The closest analog I can come up with is Sega's Bonanza Brothers, which wouldn't even exist for another year. The simple look probably comes down to the fact that this game, like several others we've seen recently, has its origins way back in 1987. Developer HAL Labs would eventually produce several of the best-looking games on NES, and their work always spoke to technical proficiency, so the clumsy visuals of Air Fortress make for a bit of a head-scratcher. And I have to wonder whether this game might have fared better within the collective fond member berries of NES fans if it had looked more like Kabuki Quantum Fighter or something. Because honestly, Air Fortress plays a lot better than it looks. The action takes place across 9 stages, each of which operates in 2 phases: the approach phase and the demolition phase. You control a little space guy named Hal Bailman, whose name is a very clear reference to the movie 2001, a skewed combination of HAL 9000 and Dave Bowman.
I don't know what you're talking about, Hal.
And also to the developer itself. It also raises the specter of whether or not HAL Labs was named after HAL 9000. The late Satoru Iwata has stated that HAL is simply a single-digit cipher shift of IBM. But people suspected that HAL 9000 derived its name as a dig at IBM, though 2001 author Arthur C. Clarke stated that that wasn't the case at all. But that's all beside the point, and in any case, fussing about the alphabet is more of a topic for the second game in this episode. Back to the game, HAL needs to destroy 9 alien fortresses single-handedly before they rain destruction on his home world. That's a pretty big task for a little guy who looks like a Duplo minifig. Worse, he doesn't even get to pilot a killer starcraft like the Vic Viper. HAL rides a little rocket headlong into danger, a rocket with no shields and no power upgrade options. It's just this tiny man in his tiny rocket at a puny stream of bullets, hurtling towards certain death and dodging an increasingly harrowing array of one-hit kill hazards. Enemies, bullets, the landscape, it all explodes him in a single touch. Like the Hokuto no Ken, it all explodes him in a single touch. The auto-scrolling approach scenes do disgorge plenty of power-ups, and HAL would do well to collect them, even though they don't do anything to improve his chances of survival during the ship-based sequences. Eventually, though, HAL reaches the fortress and dismounts his ship, and once that happens, the upgrades you've collected along the way kick in. Inside a fortress, HAL gets around without a ship, but somehow he has much more endurance on his own. In the demolition phase, he relies on an energy meter that determines both his health and his flight time. HAL doesn't walk, but rather flies with a jetpack, and flight causes his energy level to degrade steadily until he touches down again. On the ground, his power level quickly regenerates back to its maximum level, or rather to its current max level. HAL's power meter doubles as a life bar, and when you take damage from enemy attacks, his maximum energy level drops permanently. Basically, you have a set maximum energy level, and power loss from flight will automatically reset back to that maximum once you touch down, but power loss from attack damage subtracts that amount of energy from his maximum number. You can boost your life max for the current stage by collecting energy icons, each of which adds 100 points of power to your total. These sometimes appear inside of fortresses, but you'll find tons of them during the approach phase, which is why you should bother with those in the first place. HAL's objective inside of each fortress is to find the power core for that base and destroy it. And in order to accomplish that, you need to collect the bomb icons that give you a high-impact alternative fire mode for your hand weapon. With the core destroyed, you then need to make your way to an exit and book it back to your ship in order to escape. In the first couple of fortresses, finding the core and your ship doesn't take much effort. One will appear next to the other. After a few stages, though, the fortresses grow more complex in their design, with branching paths and loops that you need to navigate. Make no mistake, Air Fortress lacks the complexity of a Metroidvania. There's very little true exploration to be done, no keys to find, and no skill upgrades to collect. If you reach your ship before the core, the game will eventually funnel you toward a door where you can return to the main path. The real point of the branching routes inside of fortresses is to whittle down your energy with enemy attacks. Though, to the game's credit, defeated enemies remain permanently cleared away, so it's not necessarily a bad idea to do a little advanced scouting before taking down the base core, in order to prepare yourself for a friction-free escape. All in all, it's a simple and generally straightforward game with just enough going for it to have some real appeal and replay value. It doesn't hurt that the game gets pretty tough after a few levels. Not always in a fair way, mind you, but generally in a reasonable way. Some of the things you have to deal with can seem a little unreasonable at first, like the HAL-seeking projectiles that certain enemies like to launch, and the extremely aggressive alien astronauts that battle HAL as direct mirrors to his skills. Taking progress slowly in order to prevent too many enemies from filling the screen certainly helps you from being overwhelmed, but surviving the later levels really requires you to get a sense of HAL's flight physics, his hitboxes, and the effects of weapon recoil. I actually missed out on this game back in the day, and I feel like that's a shame. My old man reflexes don't do me much good at this point, so I will never see the end of Air Fortress, but it really seems like the kind of thing that I'd have sunk my teeth into and mastered back in the NES days. And why wouldn't I? HAL pulled together a massive collection of influences from other great games here, cherry-picking classics from across the spectrum of the 8-bit era. The flight-based fortress navigation by a little guy in a yellow suit calls to mind Capcom's Section Z, the arcade version, not the NES game, which actually arrived on Disk System around the same time that Air Fortress shipped on Famicom. The particulars of HAL's movement owe less to Section Z than they do to Activision's Hero, although the zero-gravity weapon recoil feature is something I don't recall having seen in any game before. Destroying the core and escaping from the fortress as it begins to shake apart is pure Metroid, obviously. And the enemy patterns in the approach scenes call to mind the very specific attack formations of Gradius and Xevious. I mean, Air Fortress even has donut-shaped enemies that dart out of reach and retreat as soon as they cross your line of fire. A pure Xevious bit if ever I've seen one. And finally, the dual-mode action, where the hero disembarks from his ship in order to fight on foot, more or less, calls to mind Blaster Master and the Guardian Legend. Especially the Guardian Legend. Except Air Fortress on Famicom predates both games by a good year or more. So I guess that makes this one of those unsung influences that gets overlooked in favor of cooler, more graphically impressive games. Like a lot of these delayed releases we've been seeing in 1989, Air Fortress probably would have fared better with more of a simultaneous international launch. Like Dragon Warrior, also a HAL joint to some degree, its years late arrival in the US means that it showed up on NES well after the launch of several games that had done the same thing, but better. Timing, as they say, is everything. I know a lot of people who learn to read from video games, usually from role-playing games. But chances are that some poor unfortunate schmuck out there learned the basics of the English language from high-tech expressions follow-up to Sesame Street 1, 2, 3, Sesame Street ABC. The previous Sesame Street edutainment extravaganza for NES revolved around learning numbers and making sums, tasks that had spread across several different minigames involving alien abductions. While geared toward very small children, it did at least offer a robust and well-considered package. That's not really true of Sesame Street ABC. Now, I have to admit that I can't really speak to the mindset of the 5-year-old children who comprised this game's intended audience, but I still feel comfortable predicting that this cartridge would have been a letdown even for them. Although you have about half a dozen letter-oriented tasks here, they all take place around a single carnival-themed game format. Letters revolve on a Ferris wheel, and you tap an action button once the letter you currently need to select for the task at hand reaches the bottom of the wheel's cycle. Get it wrong, and the letter falls off with no penalty besides sad music. Choosing the correct letter, however, causes it to drop off and bounce over to a high striker machine, where it lands on the striker and causes the bar to rise toward the bell at the top, rising higher each time. Every single game works like this, whether you're matching letters or spelling simple words. You always need to match 3 letters, and all the words you need to spell have 3 letters. So every cycle consists of you picking 3 letters in order to cause the striker bar to reach the bell, at which point some Sesame Street character sprites emerge and dance around with no actual animation before zipping off again. It's pretty boring, and I think even someone with a small, underdeveloped child brain would agree. The most complexity any of these games manage to offer is the mystery word event, in which you have to guess the spelling of an unidentified 3-letter word with no hints. The Ferris wheel usually provides the letters to spell multiple valid words, but only the unsignal word the game expects will actually work. Which means that this minigame amounts to sheer guesswork whether or not you can actually read. Sorry, Sesame Street ABC, but you are no Reader Rabbit. Perhaps to make up for the low-calorie entertainment and educational content of the Carnival mode, Sesame Street ABC also offers a game with no redeeming educational value, centered once again around Ernie and the bathtub. In this minigame, players need to place tiles on a grid in order to guide Rubber Ducky to Ernie's bathtub. Once you've successfully created a pipeline, Rubber Ducky makes its way along the route, with each tile playing out a different animation based on its orientation. This plays more or less like Pipe Dream, a game that made its debut on personal computers just a couple of months before Sesame Street ABC arrived. A profound case of convergent design evolution, you may ask? Well, no. Sesame Street ABC combines 2 standalone releases for personal computers dating back several years. There was Let Her Go Round, which shipped in 1984, and Ernie's Big Splash, which arrived in 1986. Anemic as this cartridge may seem, bear in mind that the original computer diskettes only contained half of this game at a time. Anyway, Ernie's Big Splash predates Pipe Dream by 3 years, which would give it the claim to the status of originator, if not for the fact that both games just ripped off Konami's Locomotion from 1982. Like Sesame Street 1, 2, 3, Sesame Street ABC comes to us via Rare Limited, though according to Game Developer Research Institute, it was actually put together by Zippo Games working under subcontract for Rare. I guess even Rare's prolific output had its limits. Anyway, my sympathies to all those tragic children who received this under the Christmas tree back in the day instead of something more interesting. Honestly, there are less plausible supervillain origin stories. All Nintendo Power could manage to rustle up for either of these games was a little video shorts preview. Understandably for Sesame Street, but I kind of feel like Air Fortress got robbed. Next time on NES Works, are you ready for some football? 'Cause I sure as hell am not.